For months, Canadian steel and lumber have been hammered with massive US tariffs 50% on steel, 45% on lumber, and even more tariffs on steel derivatives. Tariffs on aluminum, tariffs on anything that screws with Canadian workers but looks good on cable news.
And here's the twist. Every time Trump slams another tariff on us, he's not punishing Canada, he's accelerating Canada's shift away from the US economy entirely. And it ends up hurting American businesses too.
So today we're breaking down what those tariffs actually are, how they're hitting real people in Canada and in small town USA, and how Prime Minister Mark Carney is quietly rewiring our entire steel and lumber market so we're not at the mercy of the White House anymore.
And then we're going to zoom out and look at the bigger picture. The freight subsidies, the Buy Canadian rules, the crackdowns on dumping, the money going into housing and mills, and yes, why the majority of Canadians, including British Columbia, are suddenly open to a pipeline to the coast.
So grab a coffee and we're going to talk through what actually matters this week. But before we start, we have a question for you. Are these tariffs breaking Canada, or are they forcing us to finally build the economy we should have had all along? Let us know your opinion in the comments.
So let's start with what's actually happening on the ground with these tariffs, and then we'll work our way to how Canada's responding.
So, steel producers are staring down 50% tariffs. Lumber exporters are dealing with 45%. And when Trump expands tariffs to steel derivatives, things like wind towers and prefabricated structures, well, that hit a whole other tier of Canadian manufacturing.
And there's a reason this hurts. In 2024, 90% of Canada's steel, aluminum, and lumber exports went to the U.S. When Washington hits those sectors, they're not poking us. They're hitting the spine of our export economy.
Exports to the U.S. have already dropped by 24%. Mills are slowing shifts. Forestry towns in New Brunswick, Northern Ontario, and BC are scrambling to figure out who they can still sell to.
And in Maine, one of their big mills halted Canadian imports entirely, which is already sending shockwaves into New Brunswick's forestry communities.
And here's the part Trump's base will never ever admit. This hurts their own people too. In North Carolina, one of Trump's own voters had to shut down his family's lumber mill because the tariffs made it impossible to stay open. This isn't just a Canadian problem, it's collapsing businesses in rural America too.
And now here's where the story turns. Instead of Canada begging Washington to be reasonable, PM Carney is rebuilding our domestic market, piece by piece, sector by sector.
First, he's cutting down the amount of cheap foreign steel that can flood into Canada. Countries that don't have trade deals with us, places like China and India, used to be able to fill half of our steel market. Now they can only fill 20%.
And for countries that we do trade with, like Japan, South Korea, and the UK, their limit drops too. Not as much, but enough to make room for Canadian steel.
And if any of those countries go over the limit, well, boom, they get hit with a 50% penalty at the border. Simple, expensive, and suddenly not worth it.
He's also slapping a 25% tariff on things made from steel like wind towers and prefabricated buildings, because a lot of those products that were sneaking into Canada, they were cheaper than the steel itself.
And he's giving border officers real tools to stop the steel dumping, which is when countries shove a pile of cheap steel into our market and that crushes our own producers. This is something the Conservatives always talked about but never funded.
All of this opens up space for Canadian steel companies, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of space. Space they haven't had in years because the U.S. used to take almost everything.
So the goal is simple. If the U.S. is slamming the door on us, Canada's going to make sure our own companies still have the customers right here at home.
Ottawa is also cutting freight costs in half for interprovincial shipments of Canadian steel and lumber. This alone could save companies millions and make east-west trade in this country actually possible.
And if you saw our video on interprovincial trade, you already know how broken that system has been for decades. The freight costs, the paperwork, the barriers between provinces, it all made it easier to ship through the US than to ship across Canada. So check out that in the description.
This new interprovincial subsidy flips that completely. It actually makes it cheaper to keep Canadian goods moving within Canada instead of detouring through American ports.
And lumber producers aren't being left to drown. The government bumped up support to $1.2 billion, and they extended the work-sharing agreement so that 26,000 workers can keep their jobs even if their hours dip.
And Build Canada Homes is stepping in and saying, if you want federal funding for your housing project, you're using Canadian wood. This isn't about everyday Canadians, by the way, that are buying their lumber at Home Hardware. It's for big, federally backed housing builds.
And just that one decision creates $70 to $140 million in new demand for our own producers, just by choosing our own products for our own federal housing. Imagine that.
And before you say anything, this isn't about handouts. This is the Canadian way. We keep people working, we help each other through the hit, and we make sure companies have enough runway to pivot instead of going under.
And Carney spelled it out pretty clearly. The stuff we thought was a strength, selling almost everything to one customer, turned into a vulnerability the second that customer lost their mind on tariffs.
So now we're building the internal market we should have built 20 years ago.
We're talking Canadian materials for big federal construction projects, infrastructure that actually favors our producers, and rail subsidies that finally make it cheaper to ship Canadian steel across Canada, then ship it to South, let it take a little field trip through the US, and then bring it back up again.
Yeah, for years, that ridiculous detour was actually cheaper than using our own east-west system. These new subsidies, they finally fixed that.
The message is simple. Canada is preparing for a world where the US can't be counted on, and honestly, it's about time.
And here's something else the US media won't talk about. The EU and South Korea, they're also tightening protections for their own steel industries.
Because Trump's tariff crusade is destabilizing the entire global supply chain. Everyone is bracing themselves. Everyone is building buffers. Everyone is preparing for volatility.
Everyone knows you cannot trust the United States anymore, and Canada is leading that ship with actual strategy instead of yelling on television like we all do.
Now, here's the part that I actually did not expect. Canadians across the political map are quietly starting to move in the same direction.
Yeah, and yesterday proved it. PM Carney and Daniel Smith actually signed a memorandum of understanding to explore a pipeline to the BC coast. Two governments that can barely agree on lunch just agreed on a national corridor.
And Canadians are on board too, as long as there are real assurances. People want guarantees on environmental protections, Indigenous partnership, and long-term benefits for the whole country, not just Alberta and Ottawa.
Polling shows that more than 60% of Canadians support a pipeline to the BC coast.
And what I was really shocked about is that more than half of British Columbians agree. 53% say they are open to a pipeline. Didn't see that coming.
Why, though? It's because people see what's happening. When the U.S. slaps 45% tariffs on your lumber and 50% on your steel, you have to start thinking about how to get your products to Asia without begging America for access.
A pipeline to Tidewater isn't just Alberta's dream anymore. It's Canadian insurance. It's economic sovereignty. It's the ability to sell our resources to countries that aren't trying to destabilize us for political theater.
And here's what matters. This isn't about rushing a pipeline through the Rockies and wrecking the environment in the process. Those days are long over.
PM Carney's been clear about this as well. No pipeline moves an inch without full Indigenous partnership, without environmental protections that actually mean something, and without proof that it benefits the whole country, not just one premier looking for a talking point.
If Canada ever builds a national corridor or expands export capacity, we will do it together, provinces, Ottawa, and Indigenous nations, and we will do it responsibly.
Because the point isn't build anything anywhere. The point is, if the US is going to weaponize our supply chains, then Canada needs a path to the world that we can control. And it has to be done the right way.
This is bigger than tariffs. This is about whether Canada finally stops acting like the junior partner in someone else's economy.
Yeah, listen, we're a G7 economy, a major energy producer, a stable democracy, and we're finally behaving like one.
Carney's message is simple. If Washington wants to wage a tariff war, Canada will build an economy that can survive one. And this is what sovereignty looks like.
So here we are. American tariffs are hammering two of Canada's biggest industries. Communities are hurting, Workers are hurting, but Canada is adapting.
We're building new markets, building new infrastructure, supporting workers, and building unity around projects that used to be political minefields.
So if you believe Canada deserves an economy that isn't hostage to US politics, hit like, leave a comment, and share this with a friend who still thinks tariffs only hit other people.
And if you're new here, we're Dave and Deb. I'm Deb, he's Dave, and we talk politics daily about Canada, the US, Trump, and all the craziness because we live north of the madness.
Now let's take a quick detour because we want to mention that our merch is 15% off this weekend. Everything from Maple MAGA detector mugs to Who Cares sweatshirts to Vive le Canada tees. If you've been thinking about grabbing something, now is the time.
And our paid Substack is on Black Friday pricing throughout the weekend. If you want early scripts, deep dives, and the unfiltered stuff we can't say here, that's where that all lives.
So subscribe if you haven't already, and go and watch our last video about Canada's global trade pivot. And remember, Canada isn't bending, we're building.
We keep on doing the elbows up, so we will see you tomorrow, everyone.
Thanks for watching. Ciao for now.